Thank you, Diane. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us for this session. This is a surprising session for us all, I think. This is run by the Food and Agriculture Organization. And when we think of plastic, particularly if you go out there or just ask around or go to schools or ask family, plastic, things spring to people's mind. They see images in National Geographic of birds caught in plastic bags. We think of ocean plastic. We think of news items like today, the two plastic news items that caught my attention. The first one was the news that microplastics have been discovered in new falling snow in Antarctica for the first time. And I've worked in Antarctica for most of my career, so that always hit me. And then the second piece of news was a bit of fun and a personal success in the fact that one of the largest artificial grass manufacturers in Europe has now been banned from advertising their grass as being beneficial to the environment. They had a way, unbelievably, to say not only is it beneficial because it saves water and all that, but it had a magic way of cleaning the local air around it when it was laid on the grass. So these are the kind of news items we see, but there is a surprising plastic waste issue regarding agriculture, food and agriculture production. And so this brings up some very special challenges and also the offer of promise and solutions for the future. So to take us through that session and introduce it, we're very lucky in the fact that we've got Carlos Martin Novella with us today. And he's the Deputy Executive Secretary of the BRS Convention, as I'm sure you well know. And Carlos, can I hand to you to open the session, please? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you very much to be with us again here in Geneva. It's a pleasure to have you with us always. And as Paul said, it's when somebody starts thinking about plastics, and just when 3 years ago we started talking about marine plastics, this was the call. And everyone saw the plastics floating in the sea, but where these plastics were coming from? Well, you see the picture there. We can have some plastics that are helping to grow some crops. Then some places that are a bit bigger, the plastics, they are the greenhouses made in plastics. There is, once these vegetables are grown, they are packaged in plastics to preserve them a bit longer. And there is distribution in supermarkets, always also packaged in many cases with plastics. If we look into the fisheries side, also the nets are made in plastic, and some of them are discharged in the sea and become also problematic. So at the end of the day, when we are looking at how to address the problem of plastics, we can see that it's such a big problem that we need to engage all the actors. It's a trick. It's so many entry points, and we need to engage everyone. And if we look at that, FAO is really a key player. So for this, I am really congratulating our colleagues from FAO, from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, for the initiative of organizing this meeting today and for all of what they are already doing and planning to do in the future that I will explain to us in a few minutes. Because I think getting FAO on board in these global efforts to address the problem of plastics waste is really a plus. It's something that we really need to appreciate. So the use of plastics, as I said, in agriculture and agri-food systems and food value chains has become pervasive in the last 70 years. Plastics is an adaptable and low-cost material, and as such, is omnipresent in every process in our food systems. Plastics can increase productivity and efficiency in both terrestrial agriculture and fisheries and minimize food loss and waste. So they are very good, very handy. You can use for everything, but the problem is that eventually they become waste. So at the same time, they are also a major source of contamination for natural ecosystems. Through poor selection, application, and use, and end-of-life management, they accumulate in soil and aquatic environments. They can degrade into microplastics, which pose an increased concern through their potential to accumulate in food chains, threatening food security, food safety, and potentially human health as well. One more element I forgot about the agrosystems and plastics. Even on the ground, now they are using plastics as mulching for ameliorating, to amend the ground. So it's even the ground is not ground anymore, it's plastics as well. So it's another issue that we need to address. As the demand for agricultural plastics continues to grow, there is an urgent need to better monitor the quantities of plastics products that are used and leak into the environment from agriculture. Promoting circular approaches is essential to reduce plastic waste generation through prevention, reduction, reuse, and recycling. FAO report, Assessment of Agricultural Plastics and Their Sustainability, a call for action, provides irrefutable evidence to support action towards the better management of plastics in agro-food systems before and after they reach the end of life. FAO Global Assessment fills a gap in scientific research by improving the knowledge about the flow of and fate of agricultural plastic products and identifies the benefits, issues, and potential solutions associated with the major plastic products used in agriculture. In March this year, the RESAM 50 meeting of the United Nations General Assembly passed a momentous resolution to start the negotiations for the new international treaty, legally binding treaty on plastics. And it's not just plastics waste. I think we have to address plastics upstream. As when plastics are already waste, then we have a problem. We have to look how to prevent the plastics in first instance to become waste. And this requires a lot of planning, a lot of imagination, and a lot of policies to be developed. I hear very encouraging news from our colleagues from FAO. They have plans about. So it will be excellent to hear from them today what they are planning to do, what they can do in order to avoid all these plastics that sometimes are useful, either not to use them if they are not useful anymore, and eventually to ensure that they are not become waste. So thank you very much to everyone here today. And I think I have to give the microphone now to Christine.
Thank you very much, Carlos. You can sit here, maybe, yeah. Thank you very much for this nice introduction and welcoming remarks, and a very warm welcome also from my side. My name is Christine Füll. I'm coordinating the Rotterdam Convention Secretariat at FAO. It is one of the 3 chemicals and waste conventions, and I will be moderating this event tonight. Since plastic has been introduced in the 60s in agriculture, its use has become an integral part of the agri-food system. And it has been so much intertwined with the agricultural sector that a new term was born, the term plastic culture, that is now often used in the agri-food sector. We have heard already about the report that FAO has published in December 2021 on the assessment of agricultural plastics and their sustainability, and of course also call for action. And that report estimates that in 2019, the agricultural value chains used more than 12 million tons of plastic products and more than 37 million tons in food packaging. Of these more than 12 million tons, the crop production and livestock sectors are the largest users. They account for about 10 millions, and they are followed by fisheries and aquaculture, and then by forestry. So we heard already plastic in agriculture can bring many benefits, but of course also a lot of challenges and real serious problems, and mainly due to the contamination of the soil being the basic element of our food production. Without soil, we have nothing to eat. That we need to keep in mind. But to dive more into that tonight, in all these issues, the challenges, but hopefully also possible solutions, we have with us a range of expert presenters. They include one of the authors of the report, Mr. Richard Thompson. We have Carla Friedrich, a Program Management Officer from the Ecosystems Division at UNEP, who will present the work UNEP is doing on agricultural plastic in soil. She will be with us online. We have Tom Gamage from the Environmental Investigation Agency, who will present policy options, including how the new plastic treaty could address agricultural plastics. And finally, we have Pierre de Lépinot, Directeur Général of Adivalor, who will present the French Extended Producer Responsibility Scheme. These presentations will then be followed by a panel discussion with representatives from government, civil society, and the plastic culture industry. So thank you, first of all speakers tonight for joining us. And then I would leave the floor with our first presenter of this evening, Mr. Richard Thompson, Agricultural Plastics and Sustainability Specialist at FAO, who will summarize the key findings of that impressive report on agriculture of plastic in agriculture and present main findings and recommendations. Please, Richard.
Thank you, Christine. Greetings, everyone. Yes, as Christine says, I'm one of the co-authors of the report. I think it's worth mentioning that it was a combined effort with many interventions from experts. And as Christina says, I'm just going to give you a brief summary of what is in the report and its main findings and recommendations. So without further ado, I would like to just give you some information. Okay, sorry. Okay, so these are the numbers that Christine has given you. So in production, there are about 12.5 million tons. In food packaging, there's about 37 million tons. But in food distribution, storage, and processing, we were not able to actually find any data to confirm that. And as you can see from the diagram below, the major input is in livestock and crop production. So what are agricultural plastics? I'm just going to throw some slides on the screen so you can see the examples of the products. The first one is polymer-coated fertilizer, fertilizer sacks, fertilizer big bags, seedling trays, mulching film, greenhouse films, shade netting, drip irrigation, irrigation pipes, plant support ties, pesticide containers, reusable harvesting crates, hermetically sealed sacks for storing produce to avoid them being attacked by grain pests, nets for bales, silage tubes for holding fodder, film wrap for bales, also for fodder, covers for bunkers, in livestock, ear tags, and tree guards, both in here in the vines, but they're also used in forestry, tree labels, fishing nets, boat gear, traps for shellfish, and here we can see some repurposed drums for icing fish. And then finally, polystyrene fish boxes. So those are some examples. This slide shows that the quantity and availability of data of the types of products used in each region are highly variable. The graph shows our estimates for the global usage in 2018. Films are the largest category, with greenhouses, mulching, and silage. Industry has projected that their use will increase by about 50% within the decade. So we've heard about agricultural plastics having benefits and trade-offs. I just want to go through some of them. So, mulching film, together with drip irrigation, it can increase crop yields by up to 25% in field crops. It improves water use efficiency by 27%, and it suppresses weed and mold growth on fruit, reducing the need for the use of agrochemicals. Coated fertilizers control the release of nutrients, improving the efficiency of uptake and avoiding emissions. Greenhouse tunnels extend the growing season, improve yields and quality, and give farmers access to new markets. Bagging tomatoes protects the fruit from weather and insect damage. And as I've said, the hermetically sealed sacks reduce food loss and waste. Coming to the trade-offs. Those in the fishery sector have been well documented, for example, with ghost gear continuing to kill fish. Often users don't have the capacity for selection, application, management, and retrieval of plastics. Most farmers and fishers lack access to sound environmental end-of-life management, resulting in plastic waste often left contaminating soils, coasts, and the sea, or being burned or dumped. Only a small fraction is recycled. And introduction of biodegradable plastic films brings additional complexity and challenges because of the variability in degradation depending on local conditions. Evidence in China has shown that the accumulation of plastics above 240 kilograms per hectare in surface soils can decrease crop yields by 25%. And of course, in their production, they contribute to greenhouse gases and thus climate change. This diagram shows the potential pathways for degraded agricultural plastics to enter media and their impacts. Microplastic contamination in soils can come from degradation during the use of the agricultural plastics, their inappropriate disposal on farms, and from the use of soil amendments contaminated with microplastics, for example, sewage sludge, which Carla Friedrich will cover in the next presentation. Agricultural soils are thought to receive greater quantities of microplastics than oceans. Furthermore, they can absorb and concentrate pathogens and persistent organic chemicals, and they are likely to present as yet unqualified risk to human health. Microplastics from terrestrial agriculture have been shown to migrate to aquatic environments. This is a new major topic for research with an explosion of new publications, especially related to contamination of food. So in our report, we selected typical value chains in each of the 4 agricultural sectors, identified the plastic products that were used in each, and assessed the comparative risk that they posed. The risks were assessed on the basis of the source, the extent and frequency of their use, pathway, the likelihood of the plastics to enter the environment through damage, degradation, or littering, the receptor, to the extent of its contact with terrestrial and aquatic environments, and the consequence, its potential to harm plants, animals, and humans. And this is the result. So we identified these as being the priority products. The top was polymer-coated fertilizers, followed by mulching films, pesticide containers, bale films and nets, expanded for polystyrene fish boxes, PVC irrigation tape, fishing gear and aquaculture cages, and pesticide-impregnated bags for banana fruit protection. We analyzed the products in detail to look at what alternatives there were. And we used the principles of the 6 R's, which are to refuse, to avoid using plastics altogether, to redesign them, to reduce the quantities used, to reuse them, to recycle, and finally to recover. But these options should be assessed for each particular application and specific to the local context using life cycle approaches. Some examples of the potential alternatives we identified include alternative products and practices that avoid plastic, for example, cover crops and biomass to replace plastic mulching films, reusable and durable products such as glass and durable plastic covers for greenhouses. Biodegradable polymers are promising materials for plant support and mulching films, and mandatory extended producer responsibility for the collection and recycling of all non-biodegradable plastics, and incentive mechanisms to encourage sustainable practices. In summary, the initial analysis of management responses suggests that there's no single international governance framework that addresses plastics used in agriculture holistically and allows to balance its environmental and social economic benefits and trade-offs. So there is a need for further international policy instruments. We recommended two approaches, two parallel processes. The first being the development of an internationally legally binding agreement on plastic pollution. The first step for this was made when UNEP passed its groundbreaking resolution in March. The scope of the resolution addresses pollution from all sources throughout their life cycle, so plastic used in agriculture could be covered by the eventual instrument. However, the negotiating process is complex, so the extent to which agricultural plastics will be addressed and the speed of its negotiation and ratification are not certain. Tom and Tim from the EIA will address this later in this segment. The second process was related to developing a soft law instrument. International voluntary guidelines have proven very effective in assisting countries to adopt national legislation covering specific agricultural activities. Good examples are the Code of Conduct on Responsible Fisheries and the International Code of Conduct on Pesticide Management. Because they don't impose obligations on signatories, voluntary guidelines can be established more rapidly and have a wider scope than international binding agreements. They can also cover obligations of the key stakeholder groups, whereas international agreements are limited to obligations for national governments. Voluntary codes of conduct can be complementary and support the legally binding treaty. In July this year, at its 28th session, the FAO's Committee on Agriculture will deliberate or the organization's policy on agricultural plastics, including the potential for the development of a new code of conduct. The new code of conduct, if it happens, could set rules and responsibilities for all stakeholders, including governments, regional bodies, private sectors, and users. It can address a number of important aspects, including, amongst others, life cycle thinking in policymaking, regional collaboration and approaches for harmonization of practices and products, product and process standards, target setting, for example, with the collection and recycling, and licensing and registration of products and processes and users. And finally, mandatory extended producer responsibility. It could provide the basis for governments to adopt legal, policy, and management frameworks to address agricultural plastics holistically within the context of food security, nutrition, food safety, and sustainable agriculture. All these points will be discussed in this segment. One of our key findings was we don't know everything. So here you can see some of our knowledge gaps, which are around global flows and fates, life cycle assessments and alternatives, pathways and impacts of microplastics and nanoplastics, degradation behavior of biodegradable products, and impacts of agricultural plastic pollution. Here, if you've got your cameras handy, you can take a photograph of the QR code for the report. If not, if you go to the FAO booth, the QR code is on the wall, and please do take a copy of it and you can download the report. I would like to close by saying that where there are gaps in data, they shouldn't be used as an excuse not to act. So I'd like to leave you with a quote from the Deputy Director General, Maria Helena Semedo, in her foreword to the report. This report serves as a loud call for coordinated and decisive action to facilitate good management practices and curb the disastrous use of plastics across agricultural sectors. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Richard, and thank you for highlighting the complementarity also from voluntary instruments and legally binding instruments like treaty. And I'm sure most of us would not have thought that polymer-coated fertilizers are actually a very serious problem, because that is one of those issues that are invisible in principle. And this is actually what we need to raise the awareness on and where we need to work on. And this was the call for action. But we have more to talk about tonight, and it is my pleasure to now introduce you to Ms. Carla Friedrich, who is hopefully joining us from Nairobi to present UNEP's work on plastic pollution in agricultural soils. Carla, are you with us?
Great. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I was having audio problems very early on, so I'm glad. So thank you all very much, and warm greetings from Nairobi to all of you. I am Carla Friedrich, and I work at the United Nations Environment Program in our Pollution-Free Ecosystems Unit. Many thanks to FAO for inviting us to this event about a topic that we are very happy to already have a very fruitful collaboration on. I work as part of the Secretariat of the Global Partnership on Marine Litter, which is a multi-stakeholder platform with over 500 members working on issues of marine litter and plastic pollution. And in this Global Partnership on Marine Litter, we also work very closely with FAO, other intergovernmental organizations, governments, NGOs, and the private sector. I will speak very briefly about the work that we're doing with regards to agricultural plastic pollution, some of the work, and I am very eager to hear more from the other speakers and panelists. Next slide, please. So this past December, during a joint webinar with FAO and in celebration of World Soils Day, we released a working paper on plastics in agriculture. This is the first in a series of documents that we're preparing. We're actually also very close to having a foresight brief on this topic. And the idea is to continue to increase knowledge, invite discussion and action, especially among relevant stakeholders, with, of course, the purpose to reduce plastic contamination from agricultural sources. Next slide, please. So 3 important points about plastics in soil, and there are many more, but just to be very brief. Next slide, please. We have been using plastics in agriculture for decades, and we're finding large amounts of plastics in soil all over the world. Yet this topic has, until very recently, not been very widely discussed. We need to continue to measure and conduct research, and we need to agree on measurement standards, so that observations can be compared around the world, and so that action towards reduced pollution can be made, and also progress can be adequately measured when we are having, hopefully, progress in reducing this pollution. Next slide, please. So plastics also impact the soil, both the structure and the biology. As you can see here on the slide, as concentrations of microplastics in soils increase, they can influence the carbon and nutrient cycle due to the changes in soil structure and also on microbial and fungal abundance. Microplastics can also absorb other soil contaminants, such as heavy metals and toxic organics. So we need to gather more information about the potential human and environmental health impacts of agricultural plastics. Next slide, please. Microplastics can also be washed out of agricultural soils into other ecosystems, including inland waterways and the coastal and marine environment. So this is a source to sea transboundary issue as well. Next slide, please. And there are many sources of plastics in soils, and of course, Richard spoke about many of them. I will only mention two here, just to be very brief. Next slide, please. So mulch film, which is used for many purposes, such as water retention and nutrient efficiency. But the problem is that it's thin film, and the breakdown of mulch is a large source of plastic pollution in soil. And yet we have potentially alternatives that, traditional systems that have been used for a long time, such as cover crops, that could be serving many of the purposes of this. I'll speak about that in a minute. Next slide, please. We also have a sewage sludge and biosolids that are used for nutrient in many parts of the world. But they unfortunately, this sewage sludge accumulates large amounts of microplastics, including microfibers from synthetic textiles. So this is becoming, an emerging issue of concern, and it's a large source of plastics in agricultural fields. Next slide, please. Here's some of the estimated amounts of microplastics from the application of biosolids on agricultural land. We have examples here from North America, from the EU, from China and Australia. And again, we still aren't doing enough research to really look at this all around the world. So that's one of the areas that we think are needed to improve. Next slide, please. So what can we do? Next slide. So we can reuse and recycle, but this can be a huge challenge for agricultural plastics. Here we can see how much of the weight of different types of agricultural plastics increase during their use in the farms. They tend to be very contaminated. I mean, they tend to gather a lot of soil. And of course, they can also carry significant amounts of agrochemicals used in the agricultural production. Next slide, please. We can look at alternative plastic materials, such as biodegradable mulch and others. However, these are some of the many questions for which we really need more research and better answers. So are these really, as they are right now, are they better alternatives, is biodegradable or bioplastics? Do all the material labeled biodegradable really biodegrade at the rates that we needed to avoid the accumulation of plastics in soil and also the transfer to other systems? How does soil temperature and soil type affect this process? We need more research on that. We need a better understanding of the long-term impacts of soil of the long-term impacts on soil before these are really widely used by farmers. So, biodegradable plastics may be part of the solution, but we definitely need a lot more information and probably much better products that are truly biodegradable. Next slide, please. And finally, we can look also at alternative systems, such as nature-based solutions. So nature-positive food production is based on a regenerative, non-depleting, and non-destructive use of natural resources. And this can include traditional systems that have been used for centuries or millennia, but also innovative systems. So we have to also think outside the box so that we can reduce the use of agricultural plastics where possible. We need to ask and gather the right data, including economic and social and environmental data, to really figure out, some of these questions. What plastic products can easily be replaced by nature-based solutions, that some of which we already have had traditionally, and some of which can be continued to innovate. What are the short and long-term benefits of each? And how can we upscale good solutions, especially those that provide multiple co-benefits in addition to serving the agricultural purposes, such as, moisture retention, nutrient, etc. For the example that I was giving before was using cover crops to replace a plastic mulch film. This can have, in addition to the agricultural benefits, it can have benefits in biodiversity, climate, etc. So they really should be taken into account and adequately studied and economic analysis made to be able to compare them with the use of certain plastics. And the final slide, next slide, are some of our many recommendations. Are to develop standardized methods for detecting microplastics in soil to better understand residence times and also transformations. Also develop mechanisms for removing microplastic particles and fibers from the sludge, from the sewage sludge, and from biosolids that are used as fertilizer. And accelerate research and development on cost-effective plastic alternatives, including alternative materials, but also alternative systems such as nature-based solutions. And then just a final slide. So 2022 has already been a milestone year for combating plastic pollution. As Richard mentioned, at the United Nations Environment Assembly this past February and March, governments agreed on a landmark resolution to end plastic pollution, including in the marine environment, with the mandate to establish an intergovernmental negotiating committee to develop a legally binding instrument to end plastic pollution, including in the marine environment, by the end of 2024, which is very, very ambitious, and great that the ambition exists. It is really our hope that the world will come together to develop a common vision to accelerate a drastic reduction in unnecessary, avoidable, and problematic plastics, and a shift towards circular approaches, including in the agricultural context. So thank you very much, and we really look forward to continuing our collaboration with FAO and with many other organizations and key stakeholders on this topic. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Carla. And I really like the question, what can we do? Because this is what we need to ask ourselves. And I'm pretty sure that is what everybody is asking themselves, because we want to do something. And when you mention nature-based solutions and, for example, cover crops, this links also very nicely to another problem which we are dealing with under the Rotterdam Convention, the high use and sometimes misuse of highly hazardous pesticides. These can also be dealt with partly by cover crops, for example. But now I would like to invite Mr. Tom Gamage of the Environmental Investigation Agency to present policy options and how the new plastic treaty could address agricultural plastics. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much, Christine. So my name is Tom Gamage. Hello, everyone. I'm a campaigner at the Environmental Investigation Agency based out of the UK. And I'm going to talk a little bit about policy options for addressing agricultural plastics. Just to give you guys a bit of background, EIA first developed an interest in agricultural plastics through our work on the UK retail supply chain, when our research uncovered that there was extremely limited awareness among the retail sector of the scale and the impact of this issue. But there's also some intersections with other areas of our work, including illegal waste exports, of which sadly agri-plastics play a role. So as mentioned by Carla and previously Richard, sorry, let's start again. The pollution caused by agri-plastics, agricultural plastics, fits within this broader category of plastic pollution more generally, plastic pollution in the marine environment, in the freshwater environment, in the atmosphere, in the polar realms. And so in recognition of this, and the fact that the drivers of plastic pollution, as well as the impacts, are transboundary and international, the UN Environment Assembly adopted this resolution, End Plastic Pollution, towards an internationally legally binding instrument in February this year, as noted by Richard and Carla. I want to draw your attention to a couple of really key elements within this resolution. Firstly, it mentions to promote sustainable production and consumption. This is a sustainable development goal, but in the context of this mandate, this sets the stage for interventions across the full life cycle of plastics. Not just waste management, but production, product design, all the way through to waste management. Another element is that it mentions plastic pollution, including in the marine environment, not exclusively in the marine environment, as it may have been previously. So this definitely sets the stage for a dedicated program of work within this treaty, specifically for agri-plastics, which is such a unique source of pollution. A global problem really does call for a global solution. So EIA have been working on this topic for quite some time now, several years, and we've had a long time to ruminate over what we think the structure of this treaty should be, what the institutional framework should look like. And we've coalesced our thinking around 4 main pillars of action that you can see here: monitoring and reporting, plastic pollution prevention, coordination, and technical and financial support. And we really believe that this incoming Global Plastics Treaty, particularly with respect to Pillar 2, plastic pollution prevention, should really serve as the umbrella agreement for the adoption and the implementation of a comprehensive global agri-plastic strategy. We need a dedicated program of work, essentially, within this convention, specifically tailored towards agri-plastics. At the moment, as Richard mentioned, this is not guaranteed. This will be dependent on the negotiations, but we really do implore member states to ensure that this very specific and unique source of pollution is addressed through a dedicated program of work. This treaty really is the world's big shot at solving this issue and developing a really sort of bespoke and tailored approach to agricultural plastics, whilst also recognising the supportive role of regional governments and other institutions and bodies, as well as their limitations. So as we've heard from the previous speakers, the agri-plastics issue and the pollution they cause, it's global, it's dynamic, it's complex, and it's going to require a package of policies that are coordinated globally and implemented nationally or perhaps regionally. This is obviously in full recognition that where there exists potential overlaps with existing bodies or instruments, that joint working groups would be established, for example, with the FAO, to sort of clarify these respective roles and align the activities. Possible mandatory measures that could be part of a new international legally binding agreement with respect to agri-plastics could be reporting on plastic use. As we heard previously from the other speakers, it's incredibly difficult to find high quality data on the types of polymers that are used and the materials and the applications. So we would hope that there would be a reporting mechanism and a development of standardized methods for monitoring. We'd also hope for a dedicated scientific body that would provide policy advice and guidance that would sit within the governing body of the convention. Perhaps a global target for the aggregate reductions in the quantity of particularly virgin polymers used in agriculture. Restrictions as well are quite key, particularly on the most harmful and the most avoidable sources. And this, from our perspective, would include controlled release and slow release fertilizers. There's a lot of research now, as Carla touched upon, that shows the really, really horrific impact that they can have on human and environmental health. They can actually accumulate up to 50 kilograms per hectare per year. At this kind of rate, they can impact crop productivity and affect the biology, the geology, and the chemistry of the soil. But really, though, there's no silver bullet for agricultural plastics. This is a really complex material problem, and the options need to be assessed for each material application in the location and the climate in which they're being used. Before I move on, I just want to note that our colleagues at the Centre for International Environmental Law produced a really amazing briefing that sort of analyses and exposes the extent of intentionally used microplastics in agriculture, including controlled release fertilizers. And the briefing's at the back of the room on that table, so please help yourself to that briefing. So one of the key recommendations from the FAO report was obviously the development of a voluntary code of conduct. And far from being in competition with the treaty work, we think that they could work incredibly well together and synergize really, really nicely. And I say that for a number of reasons. And I want to use the issue of ghost gear as an example. So ghost gear or abandoned, lost, or otherwise discarded fishing gear has a number of parallels with agricultural plastics. It was actually included within the definition of agri-plastics in the FAO report. The same issues, including lack of disposal facilities, a lack of expensive disposal facilities, a lack of alternatives, a lack of incentives. These are all parallels that exist between the two. And there already exists an FAO voluntary framework for the marking of fishing gear, which was developed and adopted in consultation, technical consultations with various different stakeholders and negotiations with governments. And now the FAO is supporting the uptake of these through multi-stakeholder initiatives like the Global Ghost Gear Initiative and working regionally to build capacity for implementation as well. Outside the FAO, we also have the best practice framework for the management of fishing gear, which could be seen as really like a complement to the FAO guidelines for the marking of fishing gear. And this has been what we've seen with these two voluntary frameworks is that they've been incorporated into sourcing policies across the fisheries supply chain. And we've seen them adopted by eco-labels and third-party accreditation systems. And we've also seen legislators use these elements to develop policies. So these voluntary frameworks can really be seen as like an interim process, a supportive process in the meantime while the treaty is sort of being negotiated, and can also be more detailed and even more agile to sort of industry innovation at the same time than something that could be adopted at the global level. I'm really sorry I didn't press that button sooner, so you could have seen that. I suppose to summarize, the voluntary frameworks really help us to develop best practices, detailed best practices and inform policy development. So in this regard, a similar set of voluntary guidelines for agricultural plastics would be remarkably useful throughout the treaty negotiations in advance of that to help and identify the most problematic sources and then provide producers, suppliers, retailers, everyone within the agricultural supply chain with guidance on the best practice to reduce those risks and understand what improvements can be made. So I want to reiterate, as others have mentioned, that we don't have all the answers at this stage, and sort of why would we? You know, as Carla mentioned, this is an issue which has only sort of made it into public discourse really quite recently. And what the treaty can kind of do in this regard is to set up the framework, to set up the mechanism for a really sort of robust science and policy interface that can find those solutions and that can provide evidence-based recommendations for policies to be developed. Within the plastic pollution community, if such a thing exists, there's a fairly well-recognized understanding that we need a system change scenario. And this is the system change scenario means that we need interventions across the full life cycle of plastics from production through to waste management. And we need to reimagine our relationship with plastics as materials. We would very much argue that this system change scenario needs to be emulated at other parts of the economy and within society, and this includes our food production systems. And Carla mentioned this with respect to nature-based solutions. And this includes developing food systems which that adopt arrangements that are seen in natural ecosystems. Okay, so this includes localizing production, sort of shorter, more seasonal supply chains, more regenerative agricultural practices, permaculture approaches. These are all things that need to happen that will then lead on to a reduced reliance on agricultural plastics. And throughout this process, the FAO is perfectly positioned to play a really major role, a really pivotal role throughout this, and we really look forward to continued engagement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom, and thank you for recalling that we have to reset the stage for addressing a global problem and for creating a science policy interface. I think that is a very good call you made here, and always linking it to agroecology, to nature-based solutions, because we can find the solutions. We must not give up. We have a huge problem, but we have the means to address it, and we need to work together. And with these words, I would now like to invite Pierre de L'Épinot, the managing director of the French Extended Producer Responsibility Scheme, Adivalor. And Pierre will join us virtually from France.
Hello.
And if he's online, oh yeah, I can hear you. Then over to you, Pierre.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor for me to be able to present you the feedback from our French agri-plastic waste management initiative. I would like to thank FAO for inviting me, and special thanks to Richard Thompson. Next slide, please. The French national scheme, who are we? What do we do? Adivalor has as main stakeholders 300,000 farmers, 1,300 collection operators, mainly private distributors and cooperatives, and 350 marketers, meaning manufacturers or importers. Our action is supported by the network of chambers of agriculture in France and the main farmers' unions. Next slide, please. And next, push the button. Yes, thank you. How does it work? The scheme operation relies on the shared responsibility principle amongst all agri-supplies professionals. Farmers are asked to sort, prepare, and drop off their waste to specific collection points on dates set by their collection operators. Collection operators, cooperatives, private distributors collect waste drop-off by farmers. And suppliers, manufacturers or importers, finance the removal, transport, and treatment, mainly recycling, run by Adivalor. Next slide, please. Since the creation of Adivalor, we have defined 6 main driving principles. First one is interprofessional governance, meaning that all stakeholders are involved in the board. We will see it later. Share responsibility between the actors. A national and unique technical framework for the scheme, but collection designed locally, taking into account the specificity of each region. 4, non-profit business model. 5, transparency of the accounting. And 6, search for maximum economy efficiency. Next slide, please. Let me show you how our national collection scheme works. On this picture, on left in blue, the players in the marketing of the products, manufacturers and other suppliers will pay an eco fee to a legal body created by the Manufacturer Association, called CPA in France. The red arrows show the financial flows. For a multi-year contract, this eco fee covers the expenses incurred by Adivalor to implement and manage the collection, transport, and recycling of collected waste. Adivalor has no logistical and no facilities. All recovery operation, green on the diagram, are subcontracted to collection operators, mainly distributors, waste companies, and recyclers. Next slide, please. Adivalor is a not-for-profit private company, meaning our shareholders does not get any dividends. We have implemented an interprofessional governance. You can see on the picture on the right. That means that each of our shareholders, representing manufacturers, distributors, and farmers, are members of the board. Our raison d'être, our philosophy is to promote the responsible commitment of agri-suppliers and to help French agriculture to improve its environmental performance and competitiveness. Our vision, we want farmers and other stakeholders to buy into a new approach of managing waste in order to get zero waste in the field. Next slide, please. Our final goal is simply to recycle 100% of agri-plastic by 2030. That means to collect and recycle all the plastic waste produced by farmers, packaging and non-packaging. Next slide, please. Our national collection scheme is in line with enlarged responsibility of producer principles, but with a unique status, as said in the French Act Against Waste for Circular Economy, published on February 2020. Our scheme is approved as a PR system thanks to the framework agreement signed with the state, Ministry of Environment and Ministry of Agriculture since 2003. Next slide, please. In the beginning, 2001, our scheme focused on empty pesticides containers and obsolete stocks collection. Then we have enlarged the scheme to different packaging, plastic film, other plastic like bale twine and various nets. And we try to mutualize management of different types of waste. And this helped to get synergy, to increase the expertise of our staff, and to help to get economy of scale. For instance, a key success factor is to sensibilize all the farmers. Thanks to only one organization, we have to run only one single communication plant, much more efficient, without any risk of mitigation due to various messages addressed by several national schemes. Next slide, please. Here are the key figures. You have to push up. Thank you. First of all, we estimate about 116,000 tons, the quantity of waste to recover, meaning less than 100,000 tons of plastic are used for agriculture every year in France. This is less than 2% of the total consumption of plastic in France. We achieve an average collection rate of 77% after 20 years of development of the scheme. The collection rate will depend on the program. Some of the program were launched very early, other more recently, and that explained why we have not yet the same collection rate. 89,000 tons of waste, plastic waste, were collected, 4,000 more than 2002, and nearly, and this is really very successful, nearly 90% of waste collected are recycled, thanks to sorting on farm level and to the reverse logistic we have organized, and that means we don't mix the plastic from the farm until the recycling plant. This collection is really a huge logistic challenge. We transport over more than 1.2 million cubic meters every year. And we have to deal with 38,000 collection requests received from the collection points. Next slide, please. Let's have a look now on mulching films. Most mulching films used in France, and generally speaking, has a solid rate over 50%. That means when we are collecting the waste, when we collect the waste, we have to deal with more than 50% of non-plastic material, mainly vegetal and clay or other mineral compounds. So the challenge is to reduce and to minimize the solid rate. This graph showed that the higher the solid rate is, the higher the collection and the recycling cost. Together with the National Manufacturers Association, we decided to introduce an eco fee which covers the cost if the solid waste is below 50%, and additional cost over 50% of silage rate is charged directly to farmer in order, and then we try to responsibilize and to sensibilize the farmer about the consequences of high silage rate. Next slide, please. Beside, we ran a project with the CPA in France, which aims to reduce silage during removal of the film. So new technology has been developed, and you have a photo on this slides, which help to reduce significantly, dramatically the silage rate. On this example, mulching film used for carrots, we achieve a reduction over 50% of the silage rate. Next slide, please. The other big challenge for us is to increase the recycling capacities. We support the creation, or in France, or not so far in the Netherlands, the creation of 5 new recycling units. The first one, which will start end of this year, will recycle mulching film only. It's a specific technology dedicated to mulching film. 2 plants for bayonet and twines, 1 plant for big bags, and for the last planned for 2023 for stretch film used for livestock. This is mainly due to the fact that we increase a lot the quantities collected, and we deal until last year with recycling unit all over Europe, but due to the new regulation about on waste shipment in the EU, we'd rather prefer now to recycle in the country. Next slide, please. What are the other key challenges for the future? First of all, to support incorporation of PCR, post-consumer recyclates, and to help, we decide, in cooperation with manufacturers, to implement next year an eco-modulation on the fee. That means that if you incorporate some PCR in a new product, you will get a discount on the amount of the eco fee. This is a very pragmatic and real example of circular economy policy. The second challenge is to enlarge the scope of collections. And we nowadays we are running some pilots, mainly on insect-proof nets, non-woven films, and other irrigation pipes. If these pilots are successful, we will then implement EPR system with an eco fee included in the price of the product in order to finance the program. Next slide, please. So to close my presentation, let's think thicker. In 20 years, we start first step to implement collection, then to support recycling. We are now moving to the incorporation of recyclates in order to close the loop and to reduce the consumption of plastic on the whole life cycle of the product. Next slide. Thank you very much for your attention. If you need more information, see our English web pages. Thank you very much. I hope my presentation has been useful.
Thank you so much, Pierre. And you know, your goal of 0 plastic waste in agriculture by 2030, that is fantastic, and we wish you all the success for that. And we have to move on to our panel discussion now. And for that, I would like to ask our panelists to join us here on stage. That would be June Aluoch from the Pest Control Production Board in Kenya, Bernard Lemoine from Agriculture, Plastic, Environment Europe, representing the agricultural plastic industry, then Tim Gabriel from the Environmental Investigation Agency, and Richard, you already know, Richard Thompson. And I would like to start with addressing a question to June. June is from Kenya, and Kenya has a thriving agricultural sector. Could you explain how farmers use plastics in Kenya and what issues you encounter there in your country?
Okay, first I'd like to say thank you for invitation in this panel of discussion around agri-plastics. And yeah, to answer your question, plastics in agriculture in Kenya are no different from what we've seen from the presentations, from the presenters. We do have greenhouse plastics, we have pesticide containers, we have mulching films, we have irrigation pipes, drip lines, and we also have, even for aquaculture, we do have fishing nets. And I believe to some extent in livestock farming, we do have the vector control protective nets for livestock. So they are really varied. And the agricultural systems in Kenya are divided into large-scale farmers and small-scale farmers. For large-scale farmers, their systems are a bit organized, and because they are concentrated in specific agricultural zones, it is possible to identify where they are, and for their systems, it's easy to know the fate and the quantities of waste that they generally produce and where the waste ends up. And this also includes the agri-plastics that they use. So you can trace the source. And also because of the regulatory environment and the licenses that the licensing process that requires them to account for the waste that they produce, you can be able to identify the type of waste and where they'll end up. But for the small-scale farmers, there is a challenge because they are distributed around the country, and you cannot really pinpoint where plastics that is used by small-scale agricultural farmers ends up. So we can only imagine that they probably choose the cheapest option, which would probably be open burning, and not be able to know what quantities and what types of plastics they would use. And thankfully, we do have, Kenya is one of the pilot countries for the GEF program that is financing the reduction of agrochemicals and management. And this will be handling pesticides and agri-plastics. And it will be able to give us an idea of the issues that surround agri-plastics in Kenya and help us to come up with measures, both financial and regulatory, that we can be able to address some of the gaps that will be identified in terms of finding sustainable solutions for the disposal of plastics in agriculture. Yes.
Thank you so much, June. And that sounds like in Kenya, there is already quite some awareness of the problem. And at least in larger scale farms, there is already some measures taken in order to address the issue. That is great to know. And I have a question also to Tim. The UNEP member states just committed to the development by 2024 of a globally binding agreement to address plastic solution. What do you think could be the place for agricultural plastic in such an agreement? What would be the key elements of that treaty that could balance the benefits of which we heard and the trade-offs of plastic in agriculture?
Thank you and for the question, and thank you for having. My colleague, I thought, did a really good overview of many of the key elements, but I'll try to put some finer points on some different aspects for the benefit of the audience. I just want to note that at the moment, agri-plastics does not play a prominent role in the discussions that we're having, and that needs to change. And I very much welcome this event. I would encourage us to take this event to the INC that's going to happen at the end of the year and let the negotiators and delegations see the magnitude of the problem and the potential responses that we could craft together. So that's just the first aspect. And part of that is about creating the desire to establish a dedicated program of work designed around trying to address agri-plastics. Now, we have to be honest, this is a generational effort we're about to undertake. We're not going to close the deal in 2024 and immediately have all the solutions at hand. So we're going to have to design a framework that enables us to continually start and then strengthen the efforts that we need in these different respects. And so I would identify several key elements as being a part of this solution. First, I caveat all this by saying that we haven't negotiated a thing yet. So what it looks like, we don't know, but these are what I would identify as key elements that need to be included. So the first is we need to have a scientific, technical, and socioeconomic assessment panel, some body that would be able to give the answers to the questions that the governing body has when they think about how to craft their policies. My colleague referred to this as the science policy interface, and this is really what we need, but we need more than science. We also need people who can understand the technicalities of what we're trying to do, and people who can also look at the socioeconomic impacts. And in this regard, I can see this body helping us sift through the alternatives and whether they're viable, compostable materials, how to eliminate microplastics in fertilizers and pesticides, what sort of systems change is required for us to be able to reduce our usage of plastics in agriculture. Now, there may be instances when we do need plastics in agriculture, and this can help us, this body can help us work on design. How can we ensure circular design and use so that when we use plastics, and if we collect them, we can put them back into the system and have some sort of comparable value. Lastly, what we're going to do has tremendous implications for farmers and food production. And we're going to need somebody to counsel us and advise us on how to go about and balance the trade-offs with the benefits so that we ensure that we're not sacrificing one for the other. So that's why I'm a big advocate, and we're advocating for a dedicated scientific body, technical body, socioeconomic assessment body that can help us and give these answers. In my opinion, fact-finding is policymaking, and good policymaking requires good fact-finding. So that would be one aspect. The other one is we need to worry about the means of implementation. And I think us here at the BRS recognize that the means of implementation is a very important topic to discuss. And there's several points I'd like to raise in that regard. First, we're going to need the obligations and the commitments on the books. That could be reporting and monitoring, as was mentioned previously in one of the presentations, the importance of knowing where we are, what the baselines are, and how we can measure our progress towards some sort of target or elimination. The next is we're going to have some measures or some sort of international response that looks at product design and use, and there they can assist us, these measures, in designing agricultural plastics that will be used in a way that we would be able to either recover them or have reuse and then recyclability at the end of life. The other, another aspect or key element that we're going to certainly have in the treaty will be national action plans. And so there we have the opportunity for governments to adopt policies and then to update them regularly when they update the national action plans to continually get at the problem. If we haven't addressed it, we can ratchet down and we can strengthen the measures and the policies that we adopt at the government level. Part of the means of implementation is also financial assistance. We need a stable and predictable financing to assist developing countries with meeting their obligations and commitments. That can be institutional strengthening. That can be capacity building and training. That can be with policy development and implementation. That can be pilot and demonstration projects. But we need to have the means to be able to help people to kickstart their efforts to reduce agri-plastics, agri-plastic pollution, if I may say so. And then the last sort of key element is I think we need to create a framework where we have the active involvement of implementing and bilateral agencies to help governments that need that assistance. They have the benefit of having the experience of working across different regions and countries. So there's knowledge sharing that's very important. And they can help bring ideas and ensure that the policies that the governments are putting into place are actually implemented well. And there I see a very active role for the FAO. And with that, I'll end this answer.
Thank you so much, Tim. And, you know, that is a wealth of ideas you're providing here to us. And I can also feel this energy, this will to do something. And what is in particular really encouraging is that it seems this site event is coming at exactly the right time. Because as you said, you will bring back this, you know, this awareness all of a sudden. It's not just, I mean, just in the ocean. It's not just somewhere where we can see it, but the plastic problem is basically everywhere. And so that is, I think, already a great success of this event, that we have somebody who will transport this this idea to the right body and move it further. Thank you very much, Tim. And I have a question for Bernard. Bernard, the European agricultural plastic industry has published its plastic culture strategy, which has the vision of zero plastic in fields, 100% recycled. Given that the plastic products are managed solely by farmers, what policy options should be considered to help farmers keep plastics out of their fields?
First of all, I would like to thank you very much for your invitation and to giving me the opportunity to discuss about a little bit of, I know, the plastic culture. And when I talk about plastic culture, I talk not necessarily about packaging, but I talk about non-packaging, as a matter of fact. And we have seen some picture of those products, film, twine, and net, and so on, directly linked to the agricultural production, and you understand that those products are so efficient and so important for the agricultural production and for the food security of nations that we definitely need to take care about this product. I have my little note here. To tackle the pollution, the first option is to organize the collection and to provide the farmers with a solution to handle properly the product and to manage the end of life. We saw different options on that, and you have seen a very sophisticated model with the presentation of Pierre Delpino on Adivalor. And I believe that the key of the success are there. And if we talk about policy, we need to observe what is working, what is already done, and what is giving a sustainable result. And the key point for the success is, to my own opinion, is a shared responsibility. We all see that there is a need for the extended producer responsibility in agriculture, but we need to consider and to take into account the specificity of the agricultural plastic. The management cannot be identical as the household or any other plastic. And the key success, as I said, is a shared responsibility, which means that to find the suitable solution acceptable by the farmers and adapted to the specific local condition, we definitely need to work to discuss and to decide decision with the farmers and with the distributors, the COPs and retailers. This is only all together that we can find the adapted solution in operation. And therefore, our first recommendation will be to implement a legislation ensuring the fact that altogether, all those stakeholders, and which are talk about the definition of individual responsibility on it, all together get together around the table to discuss about the way to do it. I mean, mandatory scheme is fine enough if and only if we use the expertise of the farmers, the distributors, and the converters to find the appropriate solution for it. There is, of course, many other points to see. When we are talking about plastic in aggregators, the industry today is fully committed mainly in Europe, but somewhere else also in the integrated agri-plastic management, which means that we must ensure that the product we put on the market are recyclable, which is not always the case. So if we talk about legislation, at least the product must be recyclable. Of course, we will talk later on about the integration of regenerated granule in the new product to make sure that we use fewer resources and we offer a market for the recyclate. The extended producer responsibility as a mandatory scheme should be first concentrated on on fixing priorities, fixing criteria, and objective with a reliable monitoring on what is done, not only in quantity put on the market, but also the quantity put already. I have to be short, but also quantity collected, quantity recycled, and this is exactly the work we are doing with the Circular Plastic Alliance. For instance, one of the key problems we are having is a shortage in recycling facilities all over the world, and even in Europe. Therefore, the product must go transborder, and there we have a problem with the Basel Convention in a way where the Basel Convention does not consider the specificity of the agri-plastic, which can be soiled. And they are exempt of any chemical, but it can be soiled with mineral, with organic, with water, or product who can be recovered by the recyclers. And if we cannot go transborder with those products, that puts brakes on the collection and puts brakes on the efficiency of the whole scheme. To finish, I will say that there is no pollution from plastic in agriculture if and only if the plastic, the end-of-life management is well managed by all the stakeholders and all this community of users, producer, and sellers.
Thank you so much, Bernard. Thank you for all these insights. And I would just want to come back to what you mentioned about the Basel Convention. I think we must not talk about Basel Convention as a problem. We should talk about that. We should encourage all stakeholders to work together with the Basel Convention to find solutions, to your obstacles, and to find, of course, solutions to all the transboundary waste movements. So we need all stakeholders to work together. Thank you very much.
I fully agree with you. We missed the point when it arises on the table.
No, I think I know what you meant. I would just want to highlight, it's also very good that you connect the issue with the Basel Convention, because we have the triple COP here this week and next week, and it's not by coincidence that this side event is embedded in these important meetings. So again, thank you very much, Bernard. And I have also a question to Richard. The plastic report. I could also give you this one. The plastic report strongly advocates for the extended producer responsibility scheme for all agricultural plastic products and free of charge for users. So how did you get to that conclusion, Richard?
Okay, so Bernard covered many of these points in his answer. We came to the same conclusion about shared responsibility, that there needs to be obligations for all actors in the supply, use and distribution of plastics. The reason for being mandatory, it's important that all products that are coming onto the market are covered by the collection scheme. Many voluntary schemes, when they're working by producers that have ideals for producer responsibility, they will take back their own materials voluntarily. But there will be other suppliers that don't, and that causes distortions in the market, and it means that some products are just not being collected. So if you're going to have an EPR scheme, it needs to cover all the products that are coming on to the market, but it needs to be done in a way where they can be managed efficiently by using all the stakeholders in the supply chain, as Bernard has said. The question about being free of charge to users, it's really important that there are no barriers to users from managing their wastes in an environmentally sustainable way. So by having free of charge collection, free of charge recycling, it means that there's no barrier for a farmer to actually return his waste to the distributor and to be going back and being recycled. That will mean that the actual costs of the recycling and collection could be included in the purchase price, or it could be funded through other means, through general taxation. That's something that is important for the government themselves to decide how they would like their scheme to work. But if it is the former, so that the costs are included in the original purchase price of the product, it means that when farmers are actually comparing what practices they're going to do, they can compare the true cost of using plastic compared with perhaps a more labor-intensive mechanism such as with cover crops. So it allows the farmer to make the choice that what is right for him based on an understanding of what all the real costs are. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. And maybe now would be the time to also integrate a bit more our audience that is listening carefully since more than 1 hour to what all the experts have to say, and opening up for questions from your side. Are there any burning questions in the audience which you would like to give to any of our experts? Yes, I can see the gentleman here in the first row.
Yeah, thank you very much for this panel discussion. I am Dr. Zagam Abbas from Pakistan. My point is regarding the plastic containers using in pesticide sector, in agriculture sector. So many national and multinational companies is working in Pakistan as well as in other countries. So what is your recommendation that how can we make sustainable collection and recycling regarding the plastic containers pesticides? So this is my first question. And if we add this as mentioned, that there is some voluntary mechanism of extended producer responsibility. So whether voluntary basis is viable in developing countries, it should be mandatory. So these 2 points, thank you.
Thank you so much. And who of the panelists would like to answer? Oh, yeah.
Well, first of all, I have to say that you have some extended producer responsibility scheme, fully voluntary, avoiding any uncompetition free riders and so on. It works. It's always depend on the willing to do it that way. Concerning your question about how to manage the container for pesticide, I mean, the presentation you have seen from Adivalor is they are collecting pesticide container 1.2 million cubic meter as a matter of fact, always under the same scheme with shared responsibility. You have a cost internalization, a levy applied on the product. You have some technical references and the recommendation provided to the farmers. The farmers bring back the container to the distributors, playing the role as a grouping center, and then Adivalor takes the container back for the elimination of the container. So it works. I mean, the collection rate is very high, over 95%, I believe, for the pesticide container, and maybe there are some other possibilities to do it, but at least you have an example giving good results there.
Yeah, I'd like to give an effort on the first question. If I understood it correctly, you're saying there's a lot of multinational companies operating within Pakistan, and that you're wondering how to structure the EPR system to hold them responsible. And I'll just note that the European Union has adopted a lot of producer responsibility schemes, and that involves a lot of multinationals that are also operating in other jurisdictions. But the way that they sort of capture, or construct it is, you're a producer and you're responsible if you put it onto the market within your jurisdiction. And so they have a system of determining who's putting what on the market every year, which is based on reporting. And based on that, they determine the fees that you contribute or the responsibilities that you have under the system. And so whether it's a domestic producer of agri-plastics or whether it's a multinational, it's based on what you put on the market. And that's the way they've approached it. And I think it makes sense in that regard.
I would just add one point. I think the collection rates can be a bit confusing. Some of the voluntary schemes are only about 50, 60%. The scheme that stands out at having the highest collection rate, so the proportion of containers that come back from all the containers that are put onto the market, is Brazil. And the reason for that is that Brazil has a legally mandated scheme, and there are responsibilities for farmers to return containers. And it's regulated. There are inspections on farms. So when a farmer buys a pesticide, that is registered at his distributor, his retailer. And when he returns his empty container to the Brazilian scheme, which is called IMPEV, they have a very good website which you can look at, he gets a receipt for his container. So when his farm is inspected, one of the controls is looking at what pesticides were bought and what containers were returned. And that has produced a collection rate of about 94% of all that come back.
Thank you very much, Richard, for that further explanation. And actually, having heard now so much about this extended producer responsibility scheme, I would like to actually ask June if you think that such a scheme could also function in Kenya. What is your view on that?
Yeah, I think such a scheme could work. We actually have a voluntary take-back mechanism for the empty pesticide containers in Kenya. This was initiated by the Agrochemicals Association of Kenya, and they piloted it, I think, a few years back. where they work with county government. An area was allocated and designated for farmers to deposit their empty pesticide containers. And of course, the initial results of this take-back mechanism was not so good because they could find other bottles, glass bottles, drinking bottles, but awareness creation needed to be created so that the farmers can know the type of containers need to be deposited in the collection centers. So what the Agrochemical Association does is after the bins are full, they pay for a licensed disposal service provider to come and get them and subject them to the various disposal methods, such as transforming them into fencing posts. So it has worked. It's voluntary right now, but we look forward to the EPR regulations. Actually, we have draft regulations that are yet to be adopted in Kenya, and they're in the final stages. Once they are adopted, then we will have such voluntary schemes being mandatory for most of this the producers or suppliers along the product life cycle until the end of life, to make sure that there are solutions. So yeah, we look forward to adopting EPR. Yeah.
Thank you so much, June. These are encouraging words. And I'm pretty sure that there are many more questions. And today is just the start of a long journey, I would say. For the time being, it remains only, because we have to close that session, it remains for me to thank all presenters, all panelists for being here, for giving away all your knowledge, and also, of course, for the audience to stay with us until this very late time in the evening. But I would also want to thank all the colleagues that are, let's say, invisible and had a huge contribution to the success of that event. And that would be Giulia Carcasci and Andrea Lobianco, and of course also Susan Wingfield, who had the overall organization of the whole plastic fair. And all the colleagues here, you don't even see them. They are sitting here behind the wall and taking very good care of the techniques so that we could have all the speakers online without any glitches. So thank you very much to all of those. And that leads me to some final concluding words, and that is that we have seen that soils are one of the main receptors of agricultural plastics, and they may even contain larger quantities of plastics, of microplastics, than oceans. We had that aha effect during some of the presentations. As the demand for agricultural plastic continues to grow, there is an urgent need to better monitor the quantities of plastics that are produced, used, and that leak into the environment from agriculture. And I think also about that there was common agreement. Promoting circular approaches is essential to reduce plastic waste generation through the prevention, the reduction, reuse, and recycling. This needs to be driven by both new legally binding but also voluntary international policy instruments to make up for the time gap until a legally binding instrument is in place. And with these words, again, thank you all for attending this site event, and I wish you a very nice evening.